I still remember the exact sound the pen made when my father slid it across the table toward me, slow, deliberate, like a blade being sharpened. The lawyer didn't look at me. He looked at the document. My stepmother looked at the pen. And my father? He looked straight into my eyes as he said, calmly, almost bored, "Sign it, or you get nothing." I smiled. Not because I was weak, not because I was shocked, but because in that moment, after years of silence, humiliation, and secrets finally clicking into place, I realized something they didn't know. And that's when I turned to the lawyer and asked one simple question, the kind that made his face go pale. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal, and if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one who had been betrayed by family, the very people who were supposed to protect us. But what happened to me wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated, slow-motion robbery planned by the one man I trusted more than anyone in the world, my father. Growing up, my dad wasn't just dad, he was larger than life, the kind of man who walked into a room and owned it without saying a word. He built his empire from scratch, real estate, construction, investments. By the time I was 40, he was worth hundreds of millions. To the outside world, he was a success story. To me, he was everything. I was his only biological child. My mother died when I was 9, and after that, he became both parents at once. He never said, "I love you" much, but he showed it in his own way. Private school, piano lessons, a trust fund he once told me would guarantee I'd never struggle. He used to say, "Everything I build is for you." I believed him for years. Then he remarried. At first, I tried to be supportive. She was younger than him by almost 20 years, polished, charming, the kind of woman who could smile at you while quietly measuring your worth. Her name was Victoria, and from the moment she entered our lives, something shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, nothing dramatic, just small changes. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room, family dinners that became colder, decisions about the future that suddenly didn't include me. Still, I told myself I was imagining it until the day my father stopped discussing finances with me entirely. He used to include me in everything: investment updates, property tours, long talks about legacy planning. Then one day it just stopped. When I asked, he brushed it off. "Things change," he said. "You don't need to worry about money." But I wasn't worried about money. I was worried about being erased. The first real crack came 2 years ago. I visited his office unexpectedly. I had just flown in early from a business trip and thought I'd surprise him. Instead, I surprised them. Through the glass conference room wall, I saw my father, Victoria, and a lawyer I'd never met before. And on the table between them was a stack of documents labeled Asset Transfer Agreements. My name wasn't on a single page. I didn't storm in. I didn't confront him. I did something much more dangerous. I stayed quiet because something inside me knew this wasn't just paperwork. This was a strategy. Over the next year, I started paying attention in ways I never had before. I noticed properties quietly changing ownership, companies being restructured, trusts being renamed, money moving silently. Every time I tried to ask, my father shut me down. "You're being paranoid. You're too emotional. You should trust your family." That last one almost made me laugh, because by then I had already begun to suspect the truth. I wasn't just being excluded. I was being replaced. The final blow came 3 months ago. I received a formal letter from his legal office. Not a phone call, not a conversation, a letter. It said there would be a family asset meeting to finalize inheritance structures. The wording was cold, legal, clinical, like I was a business partner, not my daughter. When I arrived that day, the atmosphere felt wrong immediately. No warmth, no small talk, just the lawyer, Victoria, and my father sitting at the head of the table. And in front of me, a thick document. The title page read, Voluntary Relinquishment of Beneficial Claims. In simple terms, I was being asked to sign away my $9.8 million in inheritance rights. My entire future, gone with one signature. My father didn't even try to soften it. He just leaned back in his chair and calmly said, "This is the cleanest way forward. Sign it and we'll ensure you're taken care of." Taken care of, like I was an employee being given severance. I felt something inside me crack, not with sadness, but clarity, because in that moment, I realized something crucial, something they had completely overlooked, something that meant they weren't just trying to push me out. They were about to make the biggest legal mistake of their lives. And as I slowly picked up the pen, smiling, I looked directly at the lawyer and asked one simple question, the kind that made his face go pale. The lawyer didn't answer me immediately, not because he hadn't heard the question, but because he understood exactly what it meant. You know that subtle shift in a room when the power balance suddenly flips? When people who thought they were in control realize they may have miscalculated? That's what happened in that moment. Because my question wasn't emotional, it wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic. It was precise, calculated, and devastating. I leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my voice calm, almost casual, and repeated it. Before I sign this, can you confirm whether this document includes a waiver of disclosure rights regarding prior trust restructuring within the last 24 months? Silence. Heavy. Immediate. Suffocating. My father frowned first. He clearly didn't understand what I was asking, but the lawyer did. And that's when his face lost color. You see, there's something my father never knew about me. He always thought of me as the emotional one, the artistic daughter, the one who chose psychology over finance, the one who wasn't built for business. But what he didn't know was what I'd been doing quietly for the past 3 years. While he believed I was drifting, uncertain, soft, I had been studying estate law, obsessively, not because I planned to challenge him, but because something inside me told me I would need to protect myself one day, and that instinct saved me. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Well," he said carefully, choosing each word like stepping on thin ice, "this document pertains solely to voluntary relinquishment of future claims." I smiled. "Future claims," I repeated softly. "Yes," he said quickly. So I continued, tilting my head slightly. "It doesn't protect against claims related to undisclosed prior asset transfers, correct?" That's when Victoria's voice cut in, sharp and impatient. "What is this about? This is a simple agreement. Stop trying to complicate it." I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes on the lawyer because he was the only one in the room who understood what was really happening, and he knew something the others didn't. If he answered honestly, their plan would collapse. If he lied, he could lose his license. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw fear. My father leaned forward, irritation rising. "This is unnecessary," he said firmly. "You either trust me or you don't." That sentence used to control me. For years it kept me silent, but that day it did nothing. Because trust isn't a weapon, and I finally understood that. I looked at him calmly. "Dad," I said quietly, "if everything is fair and transparent, then answering this shouldn't be a problem." The room tightened. The lawyer finally spoke. "No," he admitted slowly. This document does not waive rights to contest undisclosed prior transfers. And just like that, the entire atmosphere shifted. Victoria's head snapped toward him. "What do you mean it doesn't?" she demanded. He adjusted his glasses nervously. "It means," he said carefully, "if there were any significant asset transfers made without proper disclosure to all beneficiaries, those could still be legally challenged." The words hung in the air like a detonated bomb. My father's expression hardened, because now he understood what I was implying, and he didn't like it, not one bit. He leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "Are you accusing me of something?" I held his gaze. "No," I said calmly. "I'm protecting myself." That's when something fascinating happened. For the first time in my entire life, my father looked uncertain. Not angry, not dominant, uncertain, because he realized he wasn't dealing with the obedient daughter he remembered. He was dealing with someone who had been watching, learning, preparing. I slowly placed the pen back on the table. "I don't mind signing," I said softly. Victoria relaxed a little. My father leaned back, confidence returning. But then I added, "after I receive a full disclosure report of all trust restructuring, asset transfers, and beneficiary modifications made in the last 2 years." And that's when everything exploded. "That's ridiculous," Victoria snapped instantly. "There's nothing to disclose." I finally turned toward her and smiled. "So it should be easy to provide." Her eyes flashed with something raw. Not anger, fear, because she knew exactly what would happen if those records came to light. My father's voice turned cold. "You're making a mistake," he said. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "For the first time, I'm not." And that's when he said something that changed everything, something that revealed just how deep the betrayal really went. He leaned forward slowly, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "You were never meant to see those documents." The room went dead silent, because that wasn't denial. That was confirmation. In that moment, 1,000 memories clicked into place. The secrecy, the sudden financial changes, the exclusion, the coldness. It wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic, planned, and deliberate. They hadn't just tried to remove me from the future. They had already been removing me from the past, piece by piece, year by year, without telling me. I felt something shift inside me then. Not heartbreak, not anger. Something colder, something clearer. Acceptance. Because the truth was undeniable now. This wasn't about money. It never had been. This was about control. And they thought they had already won. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped softly against the marble floor, and all 3 of them watched me, waiting to see what I would do next. I picked up the document, closed it gently, and slid it back across the table. "I won't sign," I said calmly. Victoria's face went pale. My father's jaw tightened. And the lawyer? He looked like he wanted to disappear, because he knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was the beginning of a legal war, one that could expose everything. But what none of them realized in that moment was that I already had something far more powerful than suspicion, something they never expected me to have, something that could destroy their entire plan in a single move. And as I walked toward the door, my father's voice stopped me, low, tense, almost threatening. "If you walk out now, there will be consequences you cannot undo." I paused, hand on the door handle, and without turning around, I replied, "There already are." Then I opened the door and stepped into the hallway where someone was waiting for me, someone who held the one piece of evidence that could bring everything crashing down. The moment I stepped into the hallway, my heartbeat didn't race. It slowed. That's what shock does sometimes. It doesn't make you panic. It makes everything feel eerily calm, like you've already crossed a line you can't come back from. And standing near the elevator, pretending to scroll on his phone, was the person who had just changed the course of my life. Daniel, my father's former financial controller, the man who had worked beside him for nearly 15 years, the man who had suddenly resigned 6 months ago under what my father described as personal reasons. But there was nothing personal about it, and we both knew that. When Daniel looked up and saw me walking toward him, his expression carried something heavy, guilt mixed with relief, like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. "You asked the question?" he said quietly. I nodded. "And?" he asked. "They confirmed everything without realizing it," I replied. For a second, he just stared at me. Then he exhaled slowly. "Good," he said, "because what I have, you're going to need it." 6 months earlier, Daniel had contacted me unexpectedly, not by phone, not by email, but by an old handwritten letter. I almost didn't open it. I thought it was spam or some outdated business notice. But when I saw his name, something inside me told me to pay attention. The letter had only one sentence. "You need to know what they've been doing behind your back." And a meeting time. No details, no explanation, just urgency. I almost didn't go. At that time, I was still clinging to hope, still telling myself that whatever was happening, it couldn't be intentional. It couldn't be betrayal. But curiosity and something deeper pushed me to meet him. We met at a quiet cafe across the city. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like someone who had spent months wrestling with a decision they didn't want to make. And the first thing he said still echoes in my mind. "You were never supposed to find out," he told me. "They were planning to erase you quietly." At first, I didn't believe him. I thought he was exaggerating or bitter about losing his job. But then he showed me the files. Not vague accusations, not speculation, documents, real ones. Asset transfer records, trust restructuring paperwork, private internal emails, everything. And when I saw the dates, I realized the truth. This had been happening for over 2 years, long before that family meeting, long before the letter, long before I even suspected anything. Daniel explained it slowly, carefully, like he knew each word would cut. After my father remarried, Victoria convinced him to restructure his estate for efficiency. At first, it seemed normal, updating beneficiary distributions, reorganizing holdings, common for wealthy families. But then it escalated. Large properties quietly transferred into newly created trusts. Company shares moved under shell entities, accounts retitled, and one detail stood out above all others. In every restructuring, my name was gradually reduced, not removed all at once. That would have been obvious. Instead, it was done slowly, strategically, until eventually I barely existed in the inheritance framework at all. I remember staring at the documents in disbelief. "This can't be real," I whispered back then. Daniel didn't argue. He just showed me one final file, an internal memo written by Victoria, dated nearly a year ago. It read, "Complete the transition before she notices. Ensure legal protection against contestation." That line changed everything, because it proved one thing beyond doubt. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. Back in the present, standing in that hallway outside the conference room, Daniel handed me a slim black folder. "This is a copy of everything," he said. My hands felt strangely steady as I took it. "Originals?" I asked. "Safe," he replied. "Multiple locations." He had thought of everything, which meant he had been preparing for this moment just as long as I had. I looked at him. "Why help me?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, then answered with simple honesty. "Because I watched you grow up," he said. "Because your father trusted me for decades, and because what they did wasn't just unethical, it was wrong." His voice lowered. "They were going to leave you with almost nothing." The words didn't shock me anymore. They just confirmed what I already knew. For years, I'd blamed myself, thought I wasn't good enough, thought I had somehow disappointed my father. But the truth was far simpler and far harsher. This had never been about me. It was about influence, control, and the power Victoria held over him. I asked the question that had haunted me since the first time I saw those documents. Did my father know everything? Daniel didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation told me more than words ever could. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. He approved every transfer. The hallway felt colder suddenly, because that answer destroyed the last fragile piece of hope I had been holding on to. This wasn't manipulation. This wasn't deception from one person. This was a decision, a choice my father had made over and over again for years. Daniel touched my arm gently. "You need to understand something," he said. "What?" I asked. "They thought you'd never fight back." I let out a quiet breath. "They don't know me very well," I said. For the first time that day, I smiled, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, because now the situation was no longer confusing, no longer emotional, no longer uncertain. It was simple. They had tried to remove me silently, and now I had proof. Just as Daniel stepped toward the elevator, he turned back and said, "One more thing." He turned back and said, "One more thing. There's something in those files you haven't seen yet." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" His expression tightened. "There's a transfer they rushed last month," he said quietly. "A very large one." "How large?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he said the number, and when I heard it, my stomach dropped, because it wasn't just part of my inheritance. It was something much bigger, something that didn't just affect me, something that could trigger serious legal consequences, even criminal ones. I looked down at the folder in my hands. Suddenly, it felt heavier than its weight, because now I understood something terrifying. This wasn't just a family betrayal. This had become something far more dangerous, something that could destroy reputations, fortunes, lives. And as the elevator doors opened, Daniel said one final warning. "Once you open that file, there's no turning back." The doors slid shut, leaving me alone in the hallway, holding the truth and realizing that if what he said was correct, then my father hadn't just betrayed me. He had committed a mistake so massive it could bring his entire empire crashing down. Part 4. I didn't open the folder right away, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because deep down, I already knew this was the moment where everything would change permanently. Some truths don't just hurt, they redraw the entire map of your life. I walked out of the building slowly, the cool air hitting my face as the glass doors closed behind me. The world outside looked completely normal, cars moving, people talking, the city alive as always. And that contrast felt surreal, because in my hands I held something that could collapse an empire, my father's empire. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes before opening the folder. My fingers hesitated on the clasp. It wasn't fear of the legal consequences. It was something deeper. It was the realization that once I read what was inside, I would never be able to unknow it. And whatever remained of my relationship with my father would be gone forever. I took a deep breath and opened it. The first few documents were familiar, copies of the asset transfers Daniel had shown me months earlier. But then I reached the last section, a red tab marked Urgent, Priority Transfer. The date was only 4 weeks old. I turned the page, and the number hit me like a physical blow. $64.2 million, transferred out of a core holding company into an offshore trust, one I had never heard of, one that hadn't existed before. My heart started beating faster, not from emotion, but from understanding what that meant. Because this wasn't just about inheritance restructuring anymore. This was something far more serious. As I kept reading, the details became even more alarming. The transfer wasn't simply a relocation of funds. It had been classified internally under a category labeled liability shielding. That phrase made my stomach tighten, because in financial law, that usually means one thing. Someone is trying to protect assets from an expected legal threat, not future planning, not estate efficiency, protection from something coming, something big. Then I found the internal email attached to the transfer. It was from Victoria, sent to the legal team. The subject line read, "Finalize before disclosure requirements activate," and the message underneath was short but chilling. "We cannot risk exposure once the audit process begins. Ensure all documentation reflects standard estate restructuring." Audit process. My mind raced, because there was only one situation that would apply: an external investigation, government or regulatory, which meant this wasn't just about cutting me out anymore. My father's entire financial network was under scrutiny. I leaned back in my seat, trying to process it all. A cold realization settled over me. The timing of everything suddenly made sense. The urgency, the pressure to get me to sign quickly, the attempt to make me relinquish claims immediately. They weren't just trying to remove me, they were trying to protect themselves from something they knew was coming. I flipped further into the documents, and that's when I found the most devastating piece: a legal memo written by their senior attorney. It outlined the risk analysis if I refused to sign. The key line was highlighted in yellow. If beneficiary challenges prior transfers, full financial disclosure may be triggered, potentially exposing unrelated asset protection strategies. Unrelated asset protection strategies. That phrase was corporate language for something far darker: possible fraud, tax evasion, or illegal shielding. My hands started trembling, not from fear, but from the enormity of what I was realizing. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about survival, for them. Because if I contested legally, it wouldn't just reopen inheritance disputes. It could force a full audit of everything they had been hiding. And that could destroy them. I closed the folder slowly, and for the first time since this all began, I truly understood why my father had looked so tense in that conference room, why he had spoken with that edge of urgency. Why he had said, "If you walk out now, there will be consequences you cannot undo." Because he wasn't threatening me, he was warning himself. For nearly an hour, I sat there in silence. Memories flooded back, childhood moments, the way he used to hold my hand crossing the street, the late-night talks when he told me I was his greatest pride, the promises that everything he built was for me. And now the truth stood in front of me like a mirror. Everything he built had been quietly moved away from me. And worse, some of it might not even have been built legally. I realized something then. This situation wasn't just emotional anymore. It was strategic. I had two choices. I could confront him directly, or I could do something much smarter, much more powerful. I could wait, because now I had leverage, real leverage. That night, I didn't sleep. I studied the documents again and again, mapping connections, tracing transfers, understanding the timeline. And one detail stood out more than anything else: the audit mentioned in the email. It wasn't hypothetical, it had a date, 6 weeks from now, which meant my father was racing against time, trying to lock everything in place before the investigation began. And that explained the urgency behind forcing me to sign immediately. The next morning, my phone rang. The caller ID made my breath catch. It was him. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something inside me told me to answer. So I did. His voice came through calm, too calm. "Come to the house," he said. No greeting, no emotion, just a command. "Why?" I asked quietly. There was a long pause. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Because we need to talk about what happens next." I knew exactly what that meant. He knew I hadn't signed. He knew I had walked away. And now he was moving to his next step, whatever that was. As I ended the call, a strange clarity settled over me. For years, I had felt powerless in his shadow, dependent, controlled, afraid of disappointing him. But now, the balance had shifted completely, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one at risk. He was. I picked up the black folder again and realized something that made my heart pound. There was one final sealed envelope inside, one I hadn't opened yet. It was marked in bold letters, "Only if confrontation occurs." My hands went cold, because that meant Daniel had anticipated this exact moment. And whatever was in that envelope was meant to be used when everything reached the breaking point. I stared at it for a long time, then slowly broke the seal. And when I read the first line inside, my entire body froze, because it revealed something I never expected, something that made the betrayal deeper than I ever imagined, something that meant this wasn't just about money or inheritance or control. It was about a secret my father had been hiding for decades. And if it came out, it wouldn't just destroy his empire, it would destroy his entire identity. The first line inside the sealed envelope didn't look dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't even emotional. It was a simple legal statement printed in formal language, but the meaning behind it shook me to my core. Beneficiary status contingency, documentation regarding biological lineage verification. For a moment, I didn't understand what I was reading. My brain tried to interpret it logically. Lineage verification? Why would that even be relevant? Then I turned the page, and everything inside me went completely still. It was a paternity report, official, certified, dated nearly 18 years ago. I stared at the bold text, my vision blurring as I tried to process the words. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. My hands started trembling so violently I had to grip the steering wheel just to steady myself, because that result meant only one thing. The man I had called Dad my entire life was not my biological father. The world outside my car seemed to fade. Sounds became distant, muted, like I was underwater. For years I had believed our bond was unbreakable. He was the center of my childhood, my protector after my mother died, the person who told me I was his greatest pride. And now, a single document was telling me that everything I believed about my identity was incomplete, maybe even built on a lie. I kept reading. There were notes attached to the report, internal legal memos, confidential correspondence, and the timeline slowly revealed the truth. The test had been ordered shortly after my mother died, quietly, without anyone telling me, without any discussion, without any confrontation, just silence. The memo stated, "Client elects to maintain parental status publicly while adjusting estate planning privately." I felt a cold wave of realization crash over me. He had known for almost 2 decades, and he had chosen not to tell me. But the next document cut even deeper. It was a handwritten note from him, addressed to his attorney, dated years later. It read, "I will not remove her from my life. She is still my daughter in every way that matters. However, future inheritance must reflect biological reality." That sentence broke something inside me because it revealed a truth more painful than outright rejection. He hadn't stopped loving me, but he had stopped trusting me as his legacy, and that distinction had shaped everything that happened afterward. Suddenly, the past made sense. Every subtle shift, every cold distance that appeared after my teenage years, every time he said I wasn't suited for the business, every decision to exclude me from key financial planning, it wasn't just influence from Victoria. It had started long before she entered our lives. The seed of doubt had been planted decades ago, and it had quietly grown in the shadows. Tears filled my eyes, but they didn't fall, because what I felt wasn't just sadness. It was something more complex, a deep, hollow realization that my entire life had been shaped by a truth I was never allowed to know. And worst of all, he had carried that knowledge alone, never explaining, never confronting, just slowly adjusting his world around it, until I was no longer at the center. I finally understood why Daniel labeled the envelope as "only if confrontation occurs," because this wasn't just leverage, this was a nuclear truth, one that could destroy not only my father's reputation, but his personal life, his marriage, his public image, everything. Because to the world, he was known as the devoted single father who raised his only daughter after his wife's tragic death. If this became public, that story would shatter. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was another message from him, short, direct. "Come now." I stared at the screen. For the first time in my life, I realized something unsettling. I didn't know what I felt toward him anymore. Not anger, not love, not even betrayal. It was something quieter, like standing in front of a stranger who looked exactly like someone you used to know. I drove to the house slowly, the same house where I grew up, the same driveway where he taught me to ride a bike, the same front door where he hugged me after my mother's funeral and promised, "You will never face the world alone." The memory made my chest ache, because now I knew he had already been carrying a secret back then, one that would eventually place a distance between us, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. When I stepped inside, the atmosphere felt heavy, not tense, not angry, just weighted, like the air itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. He was waiting in his study, standing by the window, back turned, hands clasped behind him, exactly the way he always stood when dealing with serious matters. But this time, his posture wasn't confident. It was rigid, almost defensive. He didn't turn when I entered. He just said quietly, "You know more than you should." The words hung in the air, and I realized immediately he wasn't asking what I knew. He already knew, which meant he knew about the files, the transfers, and possibly the envelope. I stepped further into the room. My voice was steady when I spoke. "Yes," I said softly, "I do." He finally turned around, and when our eyes met, I saw something I had never seen before in him. Not authority, not control, not even anger. Fear. Deep, unmistakable fear. His gaze dropped briefly to the folder in my hands, then returned to my face, and he asked one quiet question, the kind that felt heavier than any accusation. "Did you open everything?" The room went completely silent, because in that moment, both of us understood exactly what he was really asking. Not about the money, not about the inheritance, not even about the legal documents, but about the one truth he had buried for decades, the truth that could change everything between us forever. I tightened my grip on the folder, took a slow breath, and answered him with a single word. "Yes." The color drained from his face instantly, and for the first time in my life, my father looked completely powerless, like a man standing at the edge of losing not just his wealth, but the very identity he had built his entire life around. He sank slowly into his chair, his voice barely above a whisper when he spoke. "I never wanted you to find out like this." And in that moment, I realized something chilling. This wasn't the climax of the conflict. This was only the beginning. Because now, the question wasn't about money or inheritance or even betrayal. It was about something far more dangerous. What happens when the foundation of a lifetime relationship turns out to be built on a secret? And as I stood there, holding the truth that could destroy him, I realized the next choice I made would decide whether this ended in reconciliation or complete devastation. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence in the study wasn't empty, it was heavy, layered with decades of unspoken truth pressing down on both of us at once. My father sat behind his desk, shoulders slightly hunched, staring at the folder in my hands like it contained something radioactive. And in a way, it did. Because inside that folder wasn't just evidence, it was the end of a lie he had lived with for nearly 20 years. "I was going to tell you someday," he said finally, his voice low and strained. I didn't respond right away, because we both knew that wasn't true. Not really. If he had planned to tell me, he wouldn't have buried it in confidential legal memos. He wouldn't have quietly adjusted my future behind my back. He wouldn't have tried to make me sign away everything without explanation. So instead of arguing, I asked the only question that truly mattered. "Why didn't you tell me when you found out?" He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, the man sitting in front of me didn't look like the powerful, unshakable figure I grew up with. He looked tired. "I was angry," he admitted quietly. The words hit me harder than anything else he had said. not because of what they meant, but because of how honest they sounded. "At who?" I asked softly. He swallowed. "At your mother," he said. The room seemed to tilt. My mother, the woman whose memory I had held sacred my entire life, the woman he had always spoken about with quiet reverence, the one he mourned deeply when she died. "You loved her," I said almost automatically. His jaw tightened. "I did," he replied. "But after she died, the test told me something I never expected." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "She had betrayed me long before I ever realized it." The words felt like glass shattering inside my chest, because suddenly the past I thought I knew was being rewritten in real time. He stood up slowly and walked toward the window. "I found out only weeks after the funeral," he said quietly. "I was drowning in grief, and then that report came." He paused, staring out at the garden. I felt like my entire life had been a lie. I didn't know what to say, because there was no simple response to something like that, no easy way to process it. He continued speaking, his voice distant, like he was reliving it. "I considered walking away," he admitted, "completely." The words sent a cold wave through me. "But I couldn't," he said quickly, turning toward me, "because when I looked at you, none of it mattered." Tears filled his eyes, the first time I had ever seen him cry. "You were still my daughter," he said. "You were still the child I raised, the one who held my hand at your mother's grave, the one who trusted me completely." His voice broke. "I couldn't destroy that." For the first time since opening the envelope, I felt something shift inside me, because his pain wasn't fake, it wasn't calculated, it was raw, real, and deeply human. But it didn't erase what he had done. "Then why did you try to erase me from your life later?" I asked quietly. The question landed hard. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sank back into his chair, rubbing his temples. "Because time changes things," he said finally. "How?" His eyes met mine. "Because Victoria saw the truth clearly," he admitted, "and she made me confront something I had spent years trying to ignore." My stomach tightened. "She told me," he continued slowly, "that love and legacy are not the same." The words felt cold, clinical, like something taken straight from a legal contract. "She said I could love you as my daughter, but my wealth, my empire, my legacy," he hesitated, "should go to someone who carried my blood." My chest tightened, because now I understood everything. Victoria hadn't created the doubt. She had simply weaponized it, taken an old wound and turned it into leverage. "So you listened to her," I said quietly. He nodded slowly. "At first, I resisted," he admitted, "but over time her arguments made sense." His voice dropped. "She told me that if I left everything to you, it would be like erasing my own lineage." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how deeply he had been influenced. "And what about me?" I asked. His expression twisted with guilt. "I convinced myself you'd still be taken care of," he said, "that you would never struggle." "But you weren't just taking care of me," I whispered. "You were replacing me." He didn't deny it, because he couldn't, and that silence spoke louder than any confession. After a long pause, he said something that changed the direction of everything. "I never planned to leave you with nothing." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly. "The document you refused to sign wasn't what it seemed." A chill ran through me, because suddenly his words carried a different tone, not defensive, not apologetic, but strategic. "It was meant to protect you," he said quietly. My mind reeled. "From what?" His voice lowered. "From what's coming." The air in the room went completely still, because in that moment I realized we weren't just talking about family conflict anymore. We were talking about something much bigger, much more dangerous. He took a slow breath. "The audit you saw mentioned in the files," he said, "is real." "I know," I replied. His eyes darkened. "But you don't know the full extent." "What do you mean?" His voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's not just a financial audit." My stomach tightened. "Then what is it?" He looked directly into my eyes and said the words that made my heart stop. "It's a criminal investigation." The air in the room seemed to vanish because that meant everything was far worse than I imagined, much worse. And then he added one final sentence that made the situation even more terrifying. "They aren't just investigating the company," he paused. "They're investigating me personally." Part 7. The Climax and High Tension. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap that never faded. "They're investigating me personally." For a moment, I couldn't even breathe, because everything I had uncovered until now, betrayal, inheritance schemes, hidden transfers, suddenly felt like only the surface of something far deeper, much darker, and far more dangerous. "What exactly are they investigating?" I asked slowly. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling like a man calculating how much truth he could afford to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "They believe some of my asset protection strategies crossed legal boundaries." That was the polite version, the sanitized version, the kind of language lawyers use when the real words are too explosive to say out loud. So I asked the question directly. "Are they accusing you of fraud?" His eyes met mine, and the silence that followed was answer enough. "Yes," he said quietly. The word felt like a physical impact, because this wasn't just a wealthy businessman facing technical legal issues. This was a criminal investigation, one that could lead to indictments, trials, prison. "They think I hid assets to avoid taxes and shield them from regulatory scrutiny," he continued. I stared at him, my mind racing. "How much are we talking about?" He hesitated, and that hesitation alone told me it wasn't small. "Hundreds of millions," he admitted. The room spun for a moment, because that number meant something massive, something that wouldn't just affect him, it would affect everyone connected to him, including me. "That's why you wanted me to sign," I said slowly. He nodded. "If you legally relinquished your beneficiary status, you wouldn't be tied to the estate when the investigation expands." A cold realization spread through me. "So you weren't just cutting me out," I whispered. "You were trying to protect me." His eyes softened with something like relief. "Yes." But then another thought hit me, one that made my stomach twist. "Did Victoria know this?" His expression hardened instantly. "Yes," he said, "and she supported the plan." The words sounded wrong, off, because something in his tone didn't match the explanation. It sounded like there was more he wasn't saying. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked quietly. He hesitated, and that hesitation lasted too long. Finally, he spoke. "Victoria wasn't just trying to protect the estate, she was trying to protect herself." The room went still. "From what?" His voice dropped. "Because she's involved." My heart pounded. "Involved how?" He closed his eyes briefly. "Some of the most aggressive transfers were her idea." The air felt heavy, suffocating. "And she signed off on them personally," he added. "She even managed several offshore entities herself." The realization hit me like lightning. This wasn't just a case of influence. Victoria wasn't just manipulating him, she was deeply embedded in the financial operations, possibly more than he was willing to admit. "So, if the investigation expands," I said slowly. He nodded grimly. "She could face charges too." A chilling thought formed in my mind. "And what happens if she tries to protect herself?" His gaze met mine, and I saw something dark there. Fear. Real fear. "She might shift the blame," he said quietly, "onto me." The words sent a shock through my body because now the situation had escalated beyond family conflict. This was survival, legal survival. And in high-stakes investigations, people don't stay loyal. They protect themselves at any cost. "So is that why everything moved so fast recently?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "The authorities notified us 6 weeks ago. The same timeline I had seen in the documents. They gave us a limited window before the formal audit begins." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "I was trying to settle everything before that deadline." I finally understood the full picture, the pressure, the secrecy, the desperation. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about shielding me from becoming collateral damage in a legal storm. But then one final question surfaced, one that felt like the most dangerous of all. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the start?" His expression crumpled slightly. "Because I thought I could handle it alone. I always have." He paused. "And because I was ashamed." The word landed heavily. Not ashamed of the investigation, not ashamed of the money, ashamed of how everything had unfolded between us. Before I could respond, the study door burst open. Victoria stepped inside, her face pale, eyes sharp, and filled with something close to panic. "They're here," she said breathlessly. The words sliced through the room. My father stood instantly. "Who?" She swallowed. "The investigators." Time seemed to stop, because this wasn't a future threat anymore. This wasn't a looming possibility. This was happening right now. "They're at the gate," she continued. "They have a warrant." The air in the room felt electric. My father's jaw tightened. "How much time?" "Minutes." And then her eyes shifted, landing on me, on the folder still clutched in my hands. And in that moment, something in her expression changed. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. Cold, sharp, dangerous. She took a step forward. "Give me the documents," she said flatly. The command was immediate, demanding. I didn't move. Her voice hardened. "Those files can't be seen by anyone else." The meaning behind her words was crystal clear. She wasn't trying to protect me. She wasn't trying to protect the family. She was trying to protect herself. My father stepped between us. "No," he said firmly. But Victoria's composure cracked. "You don't understand. If they find those records—" Her voice cut off suddenly, because she realized what she had almost admitted. The room fell still, and in that silence, everything became clear. This wasn't just a legal crisis. It was a ticking bomb, one that could explode at any second. I looked from my father to Victoria, at the two people who had shaped my life in completely different ways. One bound to me by years of love and hidden pain, the other by manipulation and calculated ambition. And I realized something in that moment. I held the power now, the real power, not financial, not emotional, but legal. Because inside that folder was the truth that could either save my father or destroy them both completely. And as distant voices echoed from outside the house, as the sound of car doors slammed and footsteps approached, Victoria whispered urgently, "If you don't give me those documents right now—" Her eyes locked on mine. "None of us will survive what happens next." For a moment, the entire world seemed to shrink into that single room, the study, the three of us, and the folder in my hands. Outside, I could already hear footsteps approaching across the marble floor of the entry hall, firm, official, unavoidable. The investigators had arrived. And suddenly, time felt like something fragile slipping through our fingers. Victoria's voice trembled, though she tried to hide it. "Give them to me," she whispered again. But this time, there was no authority in her tone, only desperation. Because she knew something I understood clearly now. Those documents weren't just evidence, they were leverage, the kind that decides who survives when everything collapses. My father didn't look at her. He looked only at me. His expression was unlike anything I had ever seen. Not commanding, not proud, not distant. It was something painfully human, vulnerable, almost pleading. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully see until now. For all his power, for all his mistakes, for all the secrets he carried, he was still the man who raised me, the one who held me when I cried, the one who taught me how to face the world without fear. And that realization made the decision in front of me far more complicated than it should have been, because this wasn't just about justice. It wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about who I wanted to be when everything fell apart. The footsteps outside grew louder. A knock echoed down the hallway, firm, authoritative. "This is the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit," a voice called. "Open the door." The moment had arrived, and there was no more time to think, only time to choose. Victoria took a step closer to me. Her voice dropped into a sharp whisper. "If those documents leave this room," she said, "your father will go to prison." The words landed hard because she wasn't wrong. But then she added something that revealed her true fear. "And everything he built will be destroyed. Not our family, not your future. Everything he built." That's what she cared about most. And in that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity. Victoria's loyalty was never to people, only to power. I looked at my father again. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for the folder. He didn't beg. He simply held my gaze and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a command. It was acceptance. He was ready to face whatever happened next, even if it meant losing everything. And that's when I realized something profound. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He was trusting me to decide it. I took a slow breath, and then I did something neither of them expected. I walked past them, toward the study door. The knocking grew louder. "Open immediately," the voice outside demanded. I turned the handle and opened the door. 3 investigators stood in the hallway, serious expressions, official badges, legal documents ready in hand. One of them stepped forward. "Are you the daughter of—" "Yes," I said calmly. He nodded. "We have a warrant to search the premises and seize all relevant financial documentation." I held the folder firmly, and in that moment, every possible path stretched out in front of me. I could hand it over. I could hide it. I could negotiate. I could destroy it. Each choice carried consequences that would ripple for years. But in that instant, one truth stood above everything else. I was done living inside someone else's secrets, done being controlled by lies, done being erased quietly. Whatever happened next, it had to be built on truth, even if that truth was painful. So I stepped forward and handed the folder directly to the lead investigator. His eyes widened slightly as he took it. "This may be important," I said quietly. Behind me, I heard Victoria gasp sharply. He opened the folder, scanning the top pages quickly. Then he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and respect. "Thank you," he said. In the silence that followed, something inside me shifted. Not relief, not victory, but clarity. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to someone else's decisions. I was choosing my own path. The investigators moved past me, into the study. Victoria collapsed into a chair, her composure finally shattered. My father remained standing, watching everything unfold. And when our eyes met one last time in that moment, he gave me a small, sad smile. Not angry, not disappointed, but proud. Hours later, after the investigators left with boxes of documents, after the lawyers began making urgent calls, and after the house that once felt untouchable suddenly felt fragile and exposed, my father and I stood alone in the quiet living room. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he said softly, "You chose truth over loyalty." I shook my head gently. "No," I replied, "I chose honesty over silence." He looked down, absorbing those words. Then he said something I will never forget. "You did not betray me today." His voice was steady. "I betrayed you years ago when I chose secrets instead of trust." Tears filled my eyes for the first time since this all began, because in that moment something unexpected happened. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but understanding, the kind that comes only after everything has been stripped away. Weeks later, the investigation continued. The empire he built began to fracture. Legal battles stretched ahead. Victoria eventually faced charges of her own, and the life we once knew changed completely. But one thing also changed in a way I never expected. For the first time in decades, there were no more secrets between us. We didn't rebuild our relationship overnight. Trust doesn't return that easily. But slowly, through painful conversations, through honesty, through accountability, we began to rebuild something new. Not the illusion we once had, but something real. And if there's one lesson this entire journey taught me, it's this. Betrayal doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from fear, from shame, from people choosing silence when they should choose truth. But no matter how deep the betrayal runs, you still have a choice. You can continue the cycle of secrecy, or you can break it, even when it hurts, even when it costs everything. Because in the end, truth doesn't just expose what was broken. It gives you the chance to rebuild something stronger, something honest, something that no amount of money could ever replace.